Well, good morning, at least from California. Good to see some of you on your images. It's a pleasure to be here and be in conversation with all of you. My prompt for our conversation today is entitled Learning, Relationships, and Power, Attending to Each Moment of Teaching as Pedagogical Possibility Towards Equity. So here at UC Berkeley, I have two roles, one as a professor engaged in teaching and research, but I also direct the teacher education program here at Berkeley. So part of what I bring here is thinking about what this means for teachers and what it means for new teachers in particular, but what does it mean for teachers across their professional trajectory. And as Stephanie had mentioned too, prior to coming to graduate school, I taught high school science down in South Los Angeles. And so what I share, I also think about in terms of my own trajectory, in terms of what would have been helpful, what would have helped me see possibilities of equity, especially in my instructional choices. So that's another approach or a lens that I'll bring to the conversation today. So what I'd like to do is start off with just a lay of the land and examine two common approaches to addressing inequity in classrooms. And again, there are a number of approaches here, but just to situate ourselves, I wanted to highlight two of these approaches. The bulk of the time I'd like to spend on an additional lens that I'd like to propose today, and that is attending to each moment of teaching as ethical, as political, as pedagogical, and conclude with a focus area in terms of particularly thinking about classroom technologies and how we might think about classroom technologies in relationship to the particular moments of teaching. So to start off with, what are some current prevalent approaches to addressing equity in classrooms? I'd say it's defined largely by two major approaches. One is really thinking about content. So we see this a lot in culturally responsive teaching, culturally relevant pedagogies. The idea that part of why there are inequitable outcomes in classrooms and schools is also because of the lack of relevance of content. So there are approaches in terms of trying to make content more relevant to students and particularly more culturally relevant to students. The other approach that we oftentimes see is acknowledging that there are gaps in achievement. And this notion of achievement gaps have been problematized in terms of thinking about how we might reframe it as an educational debt. And but with this idea, it's a recognition that there are inequities and we need to attend to strategies or approaches in classrooms that will somehow address the inequities that exist. So I want to begin by acknowledging that these are two very important approaches, and yet there's a possibility that things might get glossed over. So for example, even if we change the content of a classroom, even if there are curricular changes, if the ways in which we teach don't fundamentally shift, the ways in which students' knowledge is and the assets that they bring to a classroom are acknowledged and built on, much of these changes will not translate into the fundamental transformations that we desire. So what I'm going to propose here is that we also think about classroom teaching and learning as a collective progression of ethical and pedagogical moments. And to recognize the enormity of each moment in a classroom, that each moment in a classroom, each decision that we make as educators creates this opportunity for new relationships, for new learning, for new forms of dialogue. And how do we embrace the fact that each moment carries this possibility, this potential, and this magnitude? So even if we think about a classroom space, there are a number of choices, pedagogical choices, ethical choices that are made prior and during each act of instruction. So whether it is how a classroom is configured, right? Whether it's how seats are arranged, what that allows for types of communication, types of dialogue. Even in this image, we see that students are raising their hands. We see a configuration of young people looking towards the teacher. Even the very act of pointing is also an ethical and pedagogical choice at this point. What I'd like to do right now is to refrain from judgment on what any of those pedagogical choices mean, but recognize the multitude of actions that are happening and the multitude of pedagogical and ethical choices in any moment. So just for a moment before we get into this, I'd love to hear from others. What are other ways in which teachers are constantly negotiating ethical and pedagogical moments? What are the choices that we're making? Again, we briefly mentioned seating, how students respond, how they face each other or the teacher, the stance a teacher might take. If we can just go ahead and enter in the chat, a few other ideas in terms of what are the multitude of choices that teachers are making that have both pedagogical and ethical implications. Okay. Excellent. I'm seeing a couple of responses. One in terms of thinking about flexible grouping, thinking about the language teachers and perhaps students use, but also the language teachers use to address learners, allowing students to student conversations, how to respond when students say, so how to respond when students are directing things in perhaps a way that doesn't align with the initial intentions, the sequence and pacing, protocols for classroom procedures. Excellent. And again, just kind of thinking about the configuration of the classroom, the core, posters, signs. Excellent ideas. So I want to keep these in mind as we move forward. So what I want us to think about is the common discourse in educational reform, and that's the danger of strategies or approaches for all students. And as scholars such as Danny Martin, who've reminded us that this language of all students, the assumption that something can work for all students, is highly problematic because it ignores the particularities of particular or specific students. So I want to start with this premise that teaching is inherently complex and inherently comprised of imperfect choices. So if we take this approach, we might ask ourselves, in each moment, in any of the examples that all of you have already shared, how might we ask instead, who benefits and who is marginalized? Right? And this is a consistent question that I think we need to ask ourselves, because this changes even across the course of a period, or the course of a day, or the course of a school year. Oftentimes we think about these questions in terms of particular categories, but instead, how might we think about it in terms of the everyday interactions, the micro interactions? So asking ourselves, who benefits and who's marginalized? Which students are benefits, which students are marginalized? But that also raises this question, what are the implications for who students become? Who do they start to see themselves as learners, as people, as part of a larger society? But then also, who do we become as a society in relationship to the opportunities for dialogue and democratic exchange within classrooms? So when I focus on this idea of each moment of teaching, I also want to make sure that we're not losing the larger picture, because issues of inequity and injustice are rooted in history, are rooted in society, economics, and politics. So how might we think about each moment of teaching as embedded in history, society, economics, and politics? So even who we call on, we know that this is based on historical patterns of whether it's gender, class, race, language ability. But each moment that we interact with is rooted within a larger historical, social, political, and economic context. And it is also important for us to recognize that at the end of the day, as insignificant as each of the micro interactions in our classrooms might seem, these are what add up cumulatively to create our society, right? So every moment of our teaching in some ways carries this beauty, magnitude, and perhaps something that's intimidating too, to know that we are co-creating society in each moment. So that's a big picture, but what might this look like in practice? So I want to first start off with going back to this image and all the wonderful ideas that you all brought up, but really thinking about opportunities for teachers to critically reflect on practice. We can go throughout our days as teachers and oftentimes make post hoc assumptions about what happened or what didn't happen in our classrooms. What I have found powerful with my work with my pre-service teachers as well as in-service teachers is giving this moment, whether it's a snapshot of their classroom, whether it is a picture, whether it is a 2-minute video, whether it is just notes from a classroom, observations, creating the space for teachers to ask who benefits and who's marginalized. And to engage in that one question allows new possibilities into thinking about the pedagogical and the ethical opportunities that exist in each moment. And again, I'd like to stress that ideally this would be done in a professional community. We know the power of creating a lens where we look at our own practice, but look at it collectively with others. But I would want to offer this, this one simple question of who benefits and who is marginalized as one way in which we start to look at our practice and the micro moments of our practice. But I'd also like for us to think about the unique problem with digital classroom technologies when it comes to asking this question. And the real challenge here is that technologies, as we know, oftentimes black box the importance of pedagogy. So especially when we use platforms, some of you might use platforms such as iReady, they are standalone platforms that oftentimes take away the nuance of the pedagogical decisions a teacher might make. So part of what we'd like to do here is to think about how we might open that black box of technology so that we can ask this question: who benefits and who's potentially marginalized? So for that, I want to share a set of tools that a colleague of mine, Antonio Garcia, and I developed back in 2013, thinking about the use of technology to facilitate learning. And part of what we ask is, when we use a digital technology in a classroom, how do we shy away from our tendency to simply say that it's good or bad, or that students like it or don't like it, but really thinking about the pedagogical possibilities that exist? And for us, it was by asking these questions: what sort of new texts are introduced? What sort of tools are introduced? And what sort of talk is introduced? So I'm going to go through these one by one. So with texts, it's this question: what new texts will be introduced by the technology? How are traditional texts altered or remediated through new technologies? Why are these texts important for what students will learn? So part of what we're asking here is, there's a tendency to essentially reproduce what we've done in non-digital spaces into new digital spaces. So reading a textbook by itself on a digital platform fundamentally doesn't change anything about the learning opportunities. But if we ask instead what sort of new texts are introduced, it opens up a new set of questions. So for example, if we think about something as simple as a smartphone or a mobile phone, the device itself doesn't necessarily have any inherent qualities or pedagogical qualities. But it allows an opportunity for us now to introduce new texts into the classrooms. It is much easier for a teacher to ask to record a set of, or to bring in a set of images from, say, students' neighborhoods, to do an interview with their family members, to even capture sounds from places that they love to frequent. Hey, these are ways in which new forms of texts that wouldn't exist in a classroom space can now exist in a classroom space. Right? The digital technology facilitates the introduction of these new texts into a classroom space. Similarly, we ask a question, what are new tools that are being introduced? So how does the tool offer ways of collecting, representing, visualizing, analyzing, and communicating information that contributes to improved learning? What is the context of learning that makes this tool imperative to students' lives? And part of what we're asking here is a tool as simple as, say, Google Maps. When we think about culturally relevant pedagogy, when we think about projects that are embedded in neighborhoods, something such as Google Maps actually brings in a whole set of tools that allows students to see their neighborhoods, to see their communities, to see their cities or states or country in a whole different light. What this tool allows us to see was not accessible to us without the particular affordances of this tool. So it's important for us to ask, again, what new ways of collecting or representing, visualizing, or analyzing information can arise from a particular technology? And lastly, I want to emphasize this idea of talk. How do we support classroom talk that leverages the text, tools, and new forms of communication introduced to technology to support student learning? And are the ways discourse transpires within classrooms made more robust as a result of this tool? How are forms of communication limited? And again, I just want to draw on a common tool that we oftentimes use in classrooms now. That could be something as simple as Google Docs. There's a distinction here, though. Is something like Google Docs simply used to write up a document, or is it used to facilitate a new form of communication, say through the comments feature that would not have existed otherwise? So how does this very tool open up new forms of talk that would not have existed in the classroom otherwise? So what we're proposing here is that if we think about the text, tools, and talk that is introduced through new digital technologies, it allows us to open up that black box of technology and ask, what are new pedagogical affordances and what are new pedagogical constraints that emerge from a digital technology? And that allows us to then ask this question, in each moment where we use a digital technology, who benefits and who is marginalized? And it allows us to think about what are the implications for who students become and for who we become as a society. So I want to leave those as starting points for tools for us to ask, to engage ourselves, to engage teachers, and to engage other educators in thinking about the magnitude of each moment of teaching, the pedagogical possibility of each moment of teaching, the ethical possibility of each moment of teaching. And how do we do these? How do we engage in this conversation? How do we engage in this dialogue in ways that are pragmatic, feasible, and fits into the everyday practices of our schools? And
all right, welcome back, everyone. Hope that you found your small group discussions to be very thought-provoking. We have been taking a look at the Padlet, your comments and your questions, and Dr. Phillip is going to speak to some of those. If you have other questions that you would like to pose to Dr. Phillip before the session ends today, please feel free to drop them in the chat if you didn't have the opportunity to get those onto the Padlet. So Okay, good. We have a couple other questions come in. So the first question that came in was, how do opportunities or lack thereof influence the way that learners create as a result?
Stephanie, do you want me to?
That
So,
one's, yep, pitching that one to you.
uh, sorry. Could you? I was pulling up the Padlet at the same time. Do you mind?
Oh,
Do you
yeah,
mind?
sure thing. How do opportunities or lack thereof influence the way that learners create?
So I wanted to go back to an example that I heard that Christina brought up, and in the small group. Christina, do you mind actually just sharing that anecdote
Yeah, sure.
with the lunch group?
I had shared how when we shifted back to classroom teaching after being fully virtual, I had some students who actually were lamenting missing being on Zoom because they missed the chat feature. And so for them, the chat was a way for them to participate in the classroom in a way that they didn't feel comfortable doing when we were sitting face to face. And so it really prompted me to think of like, how can I kind of meet that need as we're kind of transitioning away from this virtual Zoom world.
And I really appreciated that example, as I mentioned in the small group, Christina, but wanted to also bring that to our collective attention, because it reminds us that choices that seem trivial, choices that seem rather mundane or everyday, have enormous impact for the opportunities to participate, to be in dialogue, to make meaning together, to create together, right? And I think this is a perfect example that we're working through a very complex and, again, imperfect space of teaching, where no one strategy is going to meet everyone's needs. So how do we be intentional, deliberate, and conscious of how we engage with these choices? So the very space of creating opportunities for students to make meaning, to be in dialogue. And this example that Christina provided us with is, again, a reminder that it works for some students, but not others. So how are we paying attention to the multitude of ways that we create within classroom spaces for those forms of participation? And part of that is, I think, coming back to this fundamental question of who are we becoming when we learn? And I think that's the other piece that I would love to highlight for our collective attention. I think so often I think we've gotten accustomed to thinking about learning as mastering a certain content area or certain aspects of content, which is really important. And a number of scholars, especially anthropologists, have reminded us that learning is really about becoming. And so it's this question of who are we becoming in the process? So if we think about who we're becoming, all of these opportunities, right? These opportunities to participate allow us to become certain types of people and might constrain other ways of becoming. So this idea of, especially this idea of creative opportunities to see yourself as someone who thinks critically, who inquires, who creates, those are often not the identities that many of our students leave schools with. If you ask a student, what did you do in school today? We're lucky if we get some comments about what they learned, but this idea that of who I became, right? That I struggled with ideas. I engaged in dialogue. I was making with people. How do we also think about schools as opportunities or as spaces where we create those constant opportunities, and reminding ourselves that this makes sense. We embrace this at the big picture, but it also has to happen in the things that are overlooked, the mundane, right? So even thinking about these the seemingly trivial ways in which you allow people to participate is very much tied to this larger picture of who we become.
And it sounds like there are some definite ties there to learner variability and recognizing each learner as their own whole individual who has different strengths and different areas of need and different ways of learning. We have some really great resources at Digital Promise around learner variability. So that was kind of what I was hearing as you were talking as well.
And Stephanie, just to add to that really quickly, and it's a constant reminder that schooling and education is constantly holding these tensions, right? And as you're saying, how do we recognize this deep, extensive variability? When I was with one of the groups, we were also thinking about like how extroverted people might be, how shy folks might be, how willing they're able to participate, who they're willing to engage with. But how do we keep that variability in constant tension with patterns, historical patterns that we've seen, right? So we've also recognized that we live in a society that's raced, that's classed, that's gendered, and these outcomes are not happenstance, right? They're because of systems of power. So how do we hold those two together? Because I think too often we edge on one side or the other, but how do we hold these in simultaneously, and how do we hold that tension together?
That is a great segue into our last sort of set of questions here. There's two questions that are related. How do we create safe learning spaces when the larger environment feels prohibitive or restrictive? And then how, related to that, how does leadership create safe spaces for teachers to learn trauma-free despite uncomfortable conversations?
Those are huge questions.
Those are huge. Probably can't answer them in like 4 minutes, but maybe a couple kernels of wisdom you have for us.
I mean, I think the first part is kind of thinking about recognizing that we all live in very different political contexts across this nation, and what we can do, or what our teachers can do in California looks very different from other states. I recognize that. And I also want to recognize what we see as real constraints and what we see as self-imposed constraints. Right? Sometimes there are places where we can push that we choose not to because we can abdicate that to the larger structural issues. So I do want us to think honestly, like what's our possibility? What's our real possibility here? But I think this question, who benefits and who's marginalized, is a question that we need to be asking regardless. And it's a question that can be asked, right? What we do with it might vary across different contexts, how open we are in terms of then really thinking about what are the full set of consequences might look different based on our individual district or state conditions. But as educators, we have a moral and ethical responsibility to ask this question: who's benefiting and who's marginalized? And if we can't ask ourselves that question, that is fundamentally a problem. And so if ever we feel we're in a position where we can't ask the question, who's benefiting and who's marginalizing, and what do I need to do to meet the needs of my students, that is a moment that we really have to reconsider what we're doing as teachers.
Well, I can't think of a more powerful note to end on than that. I want to thank you, Dr. Phillip, for being here today, for sharing your research and your wisdom with us. Thank you to all of our participants for today, folks who came and joined in this conversation. As I mentioned at the start, this is the last webinar in this series. So be on the lookout for a blog and a posting with the video from this, the presentation portion of this webinar. We don't capture the breakout rooms, but stay tuned, follow Digital Promise. Hopefully we will have more series like this in the future. Again, thank you all so much for being here today.